let's shoot some more cinematic video and b-roll because it's just so much fun. Okay, so a little over 2 years ago, I was still working in a company as a photographer and graphic designer, but also a videographer sometimes. And the great thing about working for a company is that sometimes people who have no clue about photography or video are gonna tell you what to do and even how to do it. For example, your boss asks you to do a short video and he wants it to look really cool and cinematic. And then when they brief you, you can already see it in your head with explosions and helicopters, and maybe you can give Leo or Brad a call to see if they want to help you out. You're super excited because it's gonna be your best work ever. And then comes the but. The but, not the butt. So then they say, but can you do it behind the building here on the parking lot because we don't have money or time to find a good location. Oh, and just use the old Nikon that's laying around here somewhere gathering dust and make sure that you're finished by tomorrow, okay? You see, you can't always have it your way. Well, in a company, most of the times you can't have it your way. But you have to be prepared, so that's why today we're gonna try and make a boring location look cool and cinematic. And of course you can't make a boring garden or parking lot look like the Mount Everest, but you have to try to make the most of it. So let's go to the backyard and try to shoot some cinematic video. Okay guys, so that entire sequence was shot right here. It's the most boring place I could find around here. Let me give you some tips on how to make this look cinematic, and it all starts with the right settings. A lot of settings are personal preference, but some are not. For example, don't use auto ISO or auto white balance because when you move the camera, the light will change and then your camera is gonna try to compensate that. It looks really bad and it's also really difficult to fix that when editing. So always use a fixed ISO and a fixed white balance. Then there's aperture, and aperture depends on what you're trying to achieve. A shallow depth of field, for example, always looks nice and cinematic. If you want that, then use a low aperture number. But it's not always the best choice because when the background is important, you don't want it to be blurred out completely. In that case, go for an aperture of 5.6 or even higher. What aperture you should use depends on the story you want to tell. And finally, we have frame rate. If you want normal speed footage, no slow motion, then keep your frame rate at 24 frames per second for cinematic footage. If you do want slow motion, then you can go for 60 or 120 frames per second, and always keep your shutter speed double the frame rate. So for 24 frames per second, the shutter speed should be 1/48th of a second. Most likely for your camera, it will be 1/50th of a second. 60 frames per second, 120th of a second, and so on. I shot this whole sequence in 60 frames per second. But don't ever shoot 60 frames per second and edit on a 60 frames per second timeline for real-time footage because it doesn't look cinematic at all. It looks way too sharp and more like the news or something like that. And also remember that if you're shooting in bright daylight and you want a shallow depth of field, so aperture 2.8, 1.8, 1.4, you're gonna need a variable ND filter, one of these. Otherwise, your footage is going to be overexposed. An ND filter like this will block the light so that you can open up the aperture all the way without overexposing your footage. It's something every filmmaker needs in their bag, and I'm using these really cheap ones. Now, some people have asked me why I use really cheap ones. Well, it's very simple because when I'm shooting, I tend to bump into things sometimes, and I rather bump into something with a cheap filter and not an expensive one. That's the reason. Okay, and then when you arrive on location, the first thing you do is scan the location for interesting objects or backgrounds. Anything that could be interesting for your video. When I came here, I saw these things. So we have the shed back there, obviously, and then when we go there, we have this nice looking wood. Looks really interesting. On this side, we have these red berries or something. I don't know what they are. Really interesting details. When we look down here, we can see the grass. It's nice and long, so we can use that in the foreground or to shift focus, for example. Then over here we have these red rose hip. I don't know how you call it. Also a really interesting detail. When we go over here, we can see here the rusty bolt. Looks nice and interesting. And then down here, for example, all that moss looks really interesting for some details. So scan the location and make a little list in your head of everything that looks interesting for your video. A technique I use a lot to make my shots more interesting and cinematic is to use something in the foreground. For example, if you want to show a wide shot of the location, then look for something in the foreground so that you can reveal that location. And not only for those reveal type shots, but having something in the foreground always looks cinematic because it looks like the camera is moving more than it actually is. It emphasizes that camera movement. Make sure to mix up your shots. Don't go for only details, for example. Use close, medium and wide shots. And also make sure that you get all those shots, even if you think that you won't need them, because it's easier to decide when you're editing that you don't need them than to come back later and do the shoot all over again. And a technique I use a lot when the location is really boring is not to go too wide. Don't reveal too much and it looks a lot more interesting. When you're shooting a boring location and you want to make it look more interesting, then moving the camera will help. But think about how you move the camera, because moving the camera like this, for example, looks totally different from moving the camera like this. Usually I prefer to move like this and like this instead of this. But it depends on the shot. And just because it's a boring location doesn't mean you have to make it look dynamic. A static shot of a boring location with just some grass moving also looks really good. It's just a completely different style. So think about what story you want to tell first. Some Hollywood movie directors almost never move the camera, and then there's others who always move the camera very frantically and vividly. And with camera movements come transitions, and you have to think about it while shooting and also before. If you want to go for a static look, for example, then don't use those fast whip transitions. But if you want to emphasize the camera movement, then those whip transitions look really good. And always plan those whip transitions. When you do a shot like this and you whip that way, then make sure that the next shot is coming this way. Now, sometimes it could be that it's too difficult to get the focus coming from a fast movement. Then you can reverse the shot. But that means that if your first shot is like this and you whip like this, then your next shot is not gonna be like this, but you start here, you go slow and you whip that way. And then when you reverse that in the editing process, you can seamlessly make the transition between that shot and the other one. Does that make sense? It's complicated in my head even. This is also a technique I really like, shifting the focus during the shot. So you start with the focus on the foreground, for example, and then while you do the shot with your thumb on the focus ring, you shift the focus to the background. Always looks really nice and cinematic. And you get the best results when you have a lens with a nice and smooth focus ring. And finally, we have music, and music is something I always focus on because it's so important. A lot of people don't pay enough attention to the music of their cinematic videos. Music can make or break your video, and you can also change the whole mood and atmosphere just by changing the music. And then, next to the music, there's also sound design or sound effects, and you don't have to make it too complicated. Just adding a few little sound effects will take your whole cinematic sequence to the next level. For example, add some subtle swoosh sounds to make your transitions better, or add some background sounds depending on where you are. Maybe some forest sounds or some street sounds. Just a few little things is all it takes. I always use Epidemic Sound for my sound effects because they have so many, it's incredible. So never forget about sound effects and music because they're just as important as the quality of your images, your shots. And that's it for today, guys. How to make a boring location look more cinematic. It's not that difficult if you carefully plan your shoot and think about what you're trying to achieve. What's the purpose and the story of your video? Very important. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.